Moral decision-making can be difficult, especially when two individuals have interdependent physiologies. The process of moral decision-making is complicated further by Hume's erroneous fact-value gap. This philosophical error has led to great harms within maternal and fetal medicine relationships. Hi, my name is Hannah Houle, and this is my capstone presentation for the University of Mary's Masters in Bioethics program. The title of my presentation is The Exercise and Limits of Autonomy Within Maternal and Fetal Medicine Conflicts. So what is a maternal and fetal medicine conflict? Essentially, it is any situation in which particular values of the mother and the interests of the child are opposed to one another. For example, it could be refusing to serve alcohol to a pregnant woman, all the way towards pregnancy. The diagnosis of a pregnancy could result in maternal death, depending on the pathophysiology. A particular example that I will use to illustrate this bioethical dilemma will be of a diagnosis causing a significant threat to the mother's life during pregnancy. Specifically, this threat would be the discovery of uterine cancer within the mother prior to the fetus reaching viability. Oftentimes, cancer is a difficult diagnosis to predict. Therefore, it will be assumed that within this particular example, the mother's life is almost certain to be forfeit if she does not take action of some sort. However, if she does wish to proceed with medical treatment for the cancer, it will harm, endanger, or cause death to the baby. In evaluating this particular bioethical dilemma, the process for bioethical decision-making for Catholics was selected. It was chosen due to the 4 pillars within it. The 4 main pillars include the importance of satisfying the basics of informed consent. Secondly, addressing objective dimensions of human action. Thirdly, the subjective dimensions of human moral decision-making. And fourthly, the development and exercising of the moral virtues. These pillars are of particular importance, as the first is primarily concerned with informed consent, a principle immediately involved with providing the necessary knowledge needed for exercising autonomy. The second and third principles of this framework are concerned with evaluating the facts of the act itself, and the fourth part are the development of virtues, which is the end of moral decision-making. From this framework, we will understand how integral the principle of autonomy is, and how an erroneous fact-value gap has harmful moral outcomes. So the first step is informed consent. Informed consent is defined as the process that allows a patient to become an informed participant in all decision-making regarding his health care. This is respect for the patient's autonomy and is rooted within moral law. As Pope Pius XII stated, the doctor has no other rights or power over the patient than those which the latter gives him, explicitly, implicitly, or tacitly. Therefore, for a patient to become an informed participant, it is the duty of the physician to provide the patient with the appropriate knowledge to determine which course to choose. So in this scenario, a physician would have to educate the patient on the 3 different options. First would be the removal of the uterus entirely, partial surgical resection, or to take no action and let the pregnancy and cancer develop concurrently with no intervention. The removal of the uterus would certainly result in the death of the fetus as an effect, but the highest likelihood of maternal survival. Partial resection of the uterus would result in great risk to the pregnancy as well as to the mother's life, yet could possibly result in both the baby and the mother both surviving. And the third option of no intervention may lead to the best outcome for the child, but could cause maternal death in the process or sometime afterwards. The second step is to evaluate the objective dimensions. That the mother and father should choose according to the outcome of life for both, or at least one member. And this is a goal which is consistent with the affirmation of life to be good. It is consistent with the Catholic Church's teaching on the dignity of life, as well as the responsibility of parenting within marriage. They also must ensure that any means towards a goal is not intrinsically evil and is appropriate, given the circumstances in attaining the goal of life. So, for instance, they would not be able to morally perform an abortion simply to save the mother's life. The subjective dimension, the third step of this moral decision-making, is to ensure that the decision or action is free and informed, not driven by fear or any other emotion that would undermine deliberation and choice. This step is closely related to the principle of autonomy and that it must be a free decision. The subjective dimension also is made sound by adopting a motive for action that improves rather than detracts from the intent. So, for instance, they would choose according to love of the mother and the child rather than fear of divine punishment or moral error. The fourth pillar of this ethical decision-making framework is moral virtue. and that these moral virtues should be exercised. The virtues of temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice are enlivened by the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And in order to exercise any virtue, especially within the particular circumstance of uterine cancer, it takes great moral courage for any individual to do so. However, it is not the individual who is alone in this, but instead they are accompanied by a community of persons, both personally as well as professionally. This community seeks to accompany those who suffer, and that would be compassion. So moral courage and compassion are also central in exercising the moral virtues. So let's dive into autonomy and how autonomy affects this decision-making framework. The meaning of autonomy has largely been debated, but the two main conditions which are always presupposed are liberty and agency. This ties in very closely with informed consent. This definition is extremely important to keep in mind as one discerns the current approach to autonomy, especially within maternal and fetal medicine relationships. So how does the principle of autonomy then become distorted? The first aspect of informed consent is liberty of the individual. However, there are fundamentally two different perspectives towards what freedom is. This is a result of a great schism in the philosophical foundation of modernity, which is driven by the philosophical wedge of Hume. Hume says an individual does not hold any responsibility for their actions, as they are meaningful only within the subjective dimension of the acting person and have no bearing on the objective world in which they live. This is a false understanding of freedom and is destructive in the sense that it has no relation to reality. If the moral actions of an individual reside only within the subjective fulfillment of the acting person, all action is devoid of any moral meaning and therefore permissible. However, we know this to be false. St. Thomas Aquinas affirms that all things seek their fulfillment in the order of the universe, and therefore what ought to be is dependent upon the is of the thing in question, otherwise known as the nature of. With Hume, an ought statement has no value as a fact, and therefore is not an actual reality. However, St. Thomas Aquinas rejects this notion. Instead, if the nature of an individual is understood correctly, there are certain things which either seek the good or detract from the good of their nature. For instance, it is more perfective for a human person to eat bread for dinner rather than wood chips, if it fills their nature as a person to eat food rather than a non-food item, and therefore they ought to do so. If one understands what a human person is, it becomes clear as to what they ought to do and pursue as perfective of their nature. At its basis, natural law theory proves that a metaphysical order exists in the universe which determines the value of things in relationship to each other. This idea Hume rejects in its totality. In healing the schism created by Hume, St. Thomas Aquinas affirms that all things seek their fulfillment in the order of the universe, and therefore what ought to be is dependent upon the is of the thing in question, otherwise known as the nature of. So how does this relate to autonomy within maternal-fetal medicine conflicts? In the framework above, it is clear that an individual must be free from controlling influences to the degree that they are able to make the best choice for themselves, informed consent. Just because a person has the capacity to choose between various options does not necessitate the fact that they are free in choosing whatever they desire. Instead, a person has the responsibility to act in a way which is in accordance with the metaphysical truths of natural law. Authentic freedom is not the ability to choose whatever option one desires, rather the ability to choose what is best according to what is good, and this entails great responsibility. In applying it to the human person, it becomes clear that certain choices have an objective dimension of moral responsibility in regards to autonomy. Conversely, there are objects of acts which are intrinsically evil, and these radically contradict the good of the person. Therefore, in contrast with Hume's understanding of autonomy, there are acts which are intrinsically good and those which are intrinsically evil. And according to the created nature of the human person, it is impossible for us as human persons to exercise our autonomy in a way which is intentionally against our own good. Therefore, in order for someone to choose evil, they must either understand it to be some version of the good, albeit distorted, or they must be suffering from a lack of freedom. So, for a person to choose an evil act, it is not a result of autonomy, but instead is of controlling influences and misinformation, and therefore not of authentic freedom. If one were to go back to the very definition of autonomy, self-rule that is free from both controlling interference by others and limitations that prevent meaningful choice, such as inadequate understanding. Therefore, within the bounds of natural law, an option for evil cannot be chosen, and yet at the same time be an authentic exercise of autonomy. However, our society does not understand this. Within law and bioethics, it has been largely misunderstood as well. especially in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut. In Griswold versus Connecticut, it was the argument of whether contraception should be allowed within marriage. This was a huge issue, which has eventually led to the protection of autonomy to an extreme extent where a woman can choose abortion. In medicine and bioethics, it has also led to the physician being able to offer to the patient whatever they want and justify this under the principle of autonomy. Within health policy and bioethics, this has also caused many issues for conscience protections, both of employees of certain facilities as well as employers in providing health insurance. It has also caused issues in regards to the healthcare industry, in essentially turning this industry into a business model of freedom, unfettered freedom of autonomy, and being able to choose whatever they want. In summary, maternal and fetal medicine conflicts have greatly been influenced by a false understanding of Hume, but can be healed by natural law. This healing of autonomy can be used within the process of bioethical decision-making for Catholics, and essentially can end up in moral decision-making, which is best for the mother and for the child. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.